Episode 14 of the Liberty Weekly podcast is brought to you by Tom Wood's Liberty Classroom. Sick of losing arguments with your statist friends? Fear no more. Now you can vanquish your intellectual foes with courses taught by top libertarian professors. Tool your intellectual arsenal and enroll today by navigating to www.libertyweekly.net/Liberty Classroom or by following the link in the show notes page.
Because the minimum wage law is most properly described as a law saying employers must discriminate against people who have low skills. That's what the law says. The law says here's a man who has a skill which would justify a wage rate of $1.50, $2 an hour. You may not employ him. It's illegal because if you employ him, you have to pay him $2.50. Well, what's the result? To employ him at $2.50 is to engage in charity. Now, there's nothing wrong with charity, but most employers are not in a position where they can engage in that kind of charity. Thus, the consequences of minimum wage rates have been almost wholly bad, to increase unemployment and to increase poverty. Moreover, the effects have been concentrated on the groups that the do-gooders would most like to help. The people who have been hurt most by minimum wage laws are the blacks. I have often said that the most anti-Negro law on the books of this land is the minimum wage law. And so I think the real answer to your question is that you must not judge a bottle solely by its label. You have to look at what's inside and see what the law or the measure produces.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Liberty Weekly podcast. I am your host, Pat McFarlane, and appearing with me, as always, is the co-host, Jerry McCullum.
Thank you, Pat.
So in this episode of the Liberty Weekly podcast, we are going to be tackling the minimum wage and getting back to some solid foundational economics here. But before we begin, I wanted to briefly outline the itinerary that we have planned for this episode. First, we're going to begin with the current minimum wage news in Seattle, and a corresponding minimum wage hike that is set here just passed by the Minneapolis City Council, as a matter of fact. And then we're going to dive into the economics of the minimum wage and talk about supply and demand, all that good stuff, and theory, Austrian theory behind it. And then we are going to delve a little bit into the progressive history of the minimum wage, which has a bit of shady influence, a little bit of eugenics in there, which we will explain later. But before we get there, I wanted to give a brief shout out to a fan that I've been interacting with on our Facebook page at facebook.com/Liberty Weekly. His name is Corey, and we had a good conversation about the show. He offered some good criticism, saying that he really liked it when we are better researched and when we can present some substantive facts. And so we have tried to integrate that into this episode and the coming episodes. But I'd also like to say that any listeners out there, find us out on Facebook, give us a like. I am often on there, and I will talk. We can talk about the show. We can talk about current events and stuff like that and just have a good time. So be sure to check us out on Facebook. So Jerry has rustled up some recent economic news from the Pacific Northwest, and mainly Seattle, in their quest to increase the minimum wage. And we have a recent paper here that suggests maybe that isn't the best policy.
Yeah, so recently a paper was released by the National Bureau of Economic Research that is studying the effect of the minimum wage increase in Seattle from $9.47 to $11 in 2015, and then to $13 an hour in 2016. And they found that in total, low-income workers, which they define as people who low-wage workers, who they define as people who work for $19 an hour or less, in total earn less revenue or have a lower income than before. So it hurts the lower class to have a higher minimum wage. And not only that, even more damning than that, in the conclusion of the article, they talk about how they mention the discrepancies between this article and many of the other studies out there that have been done studying the effects of minimum wage, and how most studies actually show no signs of an increase in minimum wage. And they say that when they limit their data by the methods that other studies have used in the past, that their findings of a loss in monthly income goes away. So from that, it implies at least that all of the other studies out there that have shown no effect of the minimum wage on income are poorly researched and aren't useful. This is the quote from the paper. This is you can find this on page 34. The link will be in the show notes. In summary, utilizing methods more consistent with prior literature allows us to almost perfectly replicate the conventional findings of no or minor employment effects. These methods reflect data limitations, however, that our analysis can circumvent. We conclude the stark differences between our findings and most prior literature reflects in no small part the impact of data limitations on prior work. Of course, it's just one paper. We can't say absolutely and outright that, look, here's the smoking gun, absolute proof, but it is pretty damning.
But we have logic on our side, Jerry.
Yes, and but that is true. We also have sound theory as well.
Yeah, so those problems kind of point to some of the inherent difficulties that you get in traditional economics by doing empirical economic analysis, in that you cannot prove all things being equal. Economics and human interaction doesn't exist in a vacuum. You can't isolate things. When it comes to statistics, you can't show direct cause and effect very well. And that's why we would assert that Austrian economics is the one true faith, or more accurate in that certain sense, because it goes off of logical deduction and using those laws of economics.
And a lot of people criticize Austrian economics for eschewing statistical analysis. And the argument against this is that a lot of statistics that people use don't necessarily imply the things that they believe that they imply, because they may be collected poorly, or they may not even represent what people believe that they represent. And so if you hang yourself upon these statistics, it can lead you to faulty conclusions because they're not necessarily accurate or useful.
Yeah, and reflected in that, I wanted to touch too, before we get too off into the weeds about that, is the minimum wage law that was passed by the Minneapolis City Council. And so they have adopted a $15 per hour minimum wage. And it was almost a unanimous vote, which really doesn't shock me, knowing the city that we live in. But the vote was 11-1. And so it means that all employers in the city will need to raise their minimum wage to $15 gradually over the next several years. So it sounds like the same implication in Seattle. And unfortunately, these topics kind of get put on the back burner because of this gradual implementation. Like, do you remember when the Seattle minimum wage was first coming out and this debate raged for months, and then everyone forgot about it, and now it's actually coming into effect.
And now they actually have to deal with the effects of it now.
Yeah. In the Forbes article that we've linked to, the writer kind of makes the claim, he says in the beginning of the article that marginal effects raising the minimum wage don't really do anything, which, I mean, all things being equal, yes, it does do something, but like we said, it's hard to isolate that. But this article says that the Minneapolis institution of the minimum wage is going to be worse than Seattle. And to support that point, the author refers to the same article that we just talked about, and he says that it's going to be worse in Minneapolis because in Seattle, the mean wage was higher than of Minneapolis. And so in Minneapolis, you have more earners in that lower bracket who are going to be forced out, and it will be illegal essentially for them to sell their labor at the value that it's actually worth. And that leads us into the actual economics of the minimum wage, which is surprisingly pretty simply driven by some basic laws.
Yeah, it's supply and demand.
Essentially, it is supply and demand. And so our theory or our proposition would go that the way to look at the minimum wage is to look at labor itself as being something sold on the marketplace.
Yep, and so it's the labor is a good sold by employees, and this is a law that is putting a price floor on the the labor that they sell.
So essentially, in the Austrian economic analysis, we would look or think of labor as a good in of itself. But like Jerry was saying, each employee, if we think of it this way, each employee is in a sense their own mini entrepreneur. Essentially, minimum wage laws make it illegal for certain entrepreneurs, i.e. workers, to be competitive because they don't have a good that can be accurately priced. And essentially, another quip that we have against the minimum wage is that it is a law that infers the use or threat of violence against peaceful people. Because how else would you instigate this law?
How else would you
enforce it?
How else would you prevent two people from doing business with each other without the use of violence?
Exactly. So essentially, we have touched on supply and demand a little bit earlier here. Another thing that we wanted to highlight was the actual, technicalities of it. So if you have a higher labor cost, we know that higher costs decrease demand for something. And so essentially, if you legislate that labor has to be more expensive, this leads to more supply than there is demand for labor. And so essentially, that leads to unemployment. These are fundamental laws of economics. I mean, this is like the law of gravity. Do progressives claim that this causes... the one claim that I've always heard is that progressives will say, okay, well, we have a higher minimum wage, so that will allow workers to spend more money in businesses. And that's just BS, essentially, because the economy doesn't grow by spending. That's a Keynesian...
That's a very Keynesian idea.
Keynesian fallacy. We're saying the way that an economy grows is by capital investment. And if you think of...
It's through you could think of it as increasements on the supply side of the chart.
Yeah, because that would drive prices down, and so people could...
Correct.
But I would say, though, that if you think of the economy like a household, if you know people who go out to eat all the time, or they spend their money on frivolous things, and they don't save their money, and they don't invest it, they don't make capital investments in things that can grow their production, they usually don't tend to be very prosperous.
To give an example using this metaphor, you can think of someone who they have to spend, let's say, an hour a day preparing their meals in some way. And no matter what, every day, an hour of their time is dedicated to making food. But then if they save their money and they invest in, let's say, blender or food processing machine, and they're able to reduce the amount of time that they spend on making food to half an hour, then that it means that it's less costly for them to have a meal now. And, it would reduce the cost of food. That's the analogy being used, except in the wider economy, it is better factories, it is more efficient techniques, it's so many different things out there that can make a person's labor do more. And that is how prosperity is created. It's not created through increasing demand. That can be done in the short term with a cost later when the market corrects itself. It's creating a surplus of labor, which would be unemployment in this scenario, because there's more labor than is demanded by companies.
And what I was saying too, because you have this unemployment essentially, is that you need a central bank to step in. In this case, what I was saying is, in order to achieve full employment, the Fed has to increase inflation so that they can
stimulate demand to remove this surplus of labor, which is something that people have talked about, the minimum wage increasing inflation often by making all of the low-priced goods more expensive. And that's something there's multiple ways that people have talked about the minimum wage can increase inflation. One of them is what you just mentioned, and the other is the increase in the necessary increase in price of goods that are made by people whose wages increase under the minimum wage. The only way to remove this shortage of labor, in other words, the only way to get rid of this unemployment, is to increase demand through the use of monetary policy, through the techniques that the Fed uses, which creates inflation, which devalues your money, which will end up undoing the effects of the minimum wage unless it's tied to inflation.
Yeah.
Which many of them aren't. I think some of these new ones are, but for a long time they have not been tied to inflation.
Yeah, and as a result, too, and this is a bit of an aside, so I won't dwell on it, but there is evidence, as Peter Schiff kind of argues in his book, The Big Crash, how the Fed lies about the consumer price index and covers up the fact, or the real amount of inflation that we do have. But one would wonder where we would be if the Fed didn't have the ability to increase the money supply like it does.
There would certainly be a lot less wars.
Yes. Well, yes, and that's an aside, too.
That's an aside, too.
Because wars are completely funded by... That's how central banking started, was from war, or a desire to start war and fund wars out of money printed out of thin air and lent to the government. But one would wonder if the government does not have or did not have the ability to inflate the money supply like that, if the effects of the minimum wage would be more apparent. There probably wouldn't be war without central banks.
Large, massive, 10-year, decade-long wars that have accomplished nothing besides guarding poppy fields.
Yeah. But I was saying essentially that you need a central bank to inflate the currency, because otherwise there's no other way that businesses would be able to actually pay their workers, with the value of the dollar being so high that the Fed needs inflation so that businesses can continue to pay their workers at that certain price. So essentially my thought is that if we didn't have the central bank inflating the currency like that, then businesses would have gone defunct a long time ago.
Yeah. Currency manipulation can cover up a lot of the poor policies that are implemented in any country, and they just instead collect all of the bad things that might happen, and they just save them for a nice crash in a couple years. They just kick them down the road until it's 2008 or sometime like that.
2017 or 18. But I also wanted to talk about Austrian price theory, in the sense that we let the marketplace discover prices for a reason. And when you are manipulating prices like this, it obviously leads to a distortion in the market. It obviously leads to inefficient allocation of resources. And there's a reason why we have the price discovery process. And if you stifle that price discovery process, then it leads to imbalances in supply and demand. And that ties into Austrian business cycle theory, but you can even bring it down to this microscopic level of, you saying that you have maybe you have a carpentry business and you have some employees, and all of a sudden now you have to pay them $15 an hour. Well, that just throws the whole business out of whack. How are you going to know? That affects your product, what you're going to charge for doing certain services, and it just throws everything off kilter. But there was another argument that's often brought to the table by conservatives, I hear a lot, that when you institute a minimum wage, it's like removing the bottom rungs. Well, maybe this isn't from conservatives, like Milton Friedman-esque types. Mm-hmm. And for all of his faults, Milton Friedman is astute on the minimum wage. And he basically says, the correct minimum wage is 0. And that when you institute a minimum wage, you're essentially removing the bottom rungs from society. And so if you have people essentially metaphorically trapped in the pit of poverty, which I don't like that imagery, because poverty is the natural state of man. But if you have a bunch of people trapped, you're trying to lower a ladder so that they can climb their way out. And if you institute a minimum wage, you remove the bottom rungs so that people metaphorically have to jump up and grasp the rungs to get up. And that what it's saying is that if you have the minimum wage, then unskilled workers have no way to gain practical job experience, because they can't sell their labor at the value that it's actually worth. So they don't have the skills to produce labor at a higher value, and they're not going to acquire those skills on the marketplace or on the job site because they're not going to, no one's going to buy their labor. Mm-hmm. So then they have to invest money in getting an overpriced degree from a college somewhere with money guaranteed by by the federal government. It's all interconnected. Everything is. But we are going to pause for a moment and thank our sponsors before we get into the dark eugenicist history behind the minimum wage. So stay tuned. As libertarians, we pride ourselves on obtaining knowledge. Fortunately, we live in an age where the entire wealth of human knowledge is right at our fingertips. For instance, could you imagine if Murray Rothbard had internet access? What about Mises? Karl Menger, anyone? Consequently, the best thing that ever happened to me was discovering that the top libertarian minds of our day do have internet access. And as a result, they have produced things like Tom Woods' Liberty Classroom, which offers 19 complete courses on everything from basic Austrian economics to intro to logic. But the best thing that ever happened to me was also the worst, because now all I do is learn. Now you can also get direct access to the top libertarian minds of today, like Bob Murphy, Kevin Gutzman, Brian McClanahan, and Jeff Herbner. And while you're at it, say goodbye to your friends and family, because you'll be busy. To enroll through our affiliate link, simply navigate to libertyweekly.net/Liberty Classroom, or follow the link in the show notes page below.
So one thing that certainly took me a long time to find out about, but is honestly quite shocking, is that in the early 20th century, progressives who wanted to create who were trying to institute the minimum wage in society knew exactly what it did and knew exactly that it decreased employment. And they wanted that, which is really strange. So during this period of time, which this is something that people have often forget about, but within the political and academic elite, eugenics was a very popular topic. And it was something that basically before it became associated with Nazism, it was something that was all the rage within the circles of the elite of society. And one of the things that people wanted to use the minimum wage for was to make as undesirables within their society unable to find employment and either become wards of the state and be sterilized or become unproductive and become less welcome within the society. A quote here that I have from Woodrow Wilson's Commissioner of Labor, Royal Meeker, is, "It is much better to enact a minimum wage law, even if it deprives these unfortunates of work. Better that the state should support the inefficient wholly and prevent the multiplication of the breed than subsidize incompetence and unthrift, enabling to bring forth more of their kind." So this is Commissioner of Labor of Woodrow Wilson. This is not a crackpot academic. This is someone who is established and as part of the mainstream of the time back then, talking about how minimum wage is something the unemployment created by minimum wage is desirable. Another example is this is a quote from Richard T. Ely, who this is a quote from a book from 1894. That's Socialism and Reform. Said that restrictions should be thrown at the employment of married women, and their employment for a considerable period before and after childbirth should be prohibited under any circumstances. There should also be a restriction of the workday, as in England, for children and young persons under 18 and for women, such a limitation having beneficial effect upon the health of the community. Night work should be prohibited for women and persons under 18 years of age, and, in particular, all work injurious to the female organism should be forbidden to women. Female organism is kind of a strange term, but it was something that was used back then. But progressives they're trying to limit the work of undesirables and women in order to shape society in a way that they deem desirable. And sometime, I'm honestly not sure when, but sometime over the 20th century, progressives forgot that the minimum wage creates unemployment, and now just believe it to be a good.
I mean, do they even really evaluate things logically? I mean, you would have to come to the table with, I don't know, but
I'm not really sure, but I'm always surprised by a lot of things that I shouldn't be. This is an aside, and I apologize, but yesterday I saw someone making a post on Facebook talking about how the USSR stood as a beacon of freedom and of human rights, and talking, lamenting like that the fact that it wasn't there and that sort of thing. I was like, human rights? Did they protect the Ukrainians' rights? What about Gulag? It was so strange and bizarre to hear that they're completely dissociated from reality, or there is something that I'm seriously missing here, because I've never heard any of them explain away the atrocities of the Soviet Union. But anyway, what I'm saying is that it seems like it's entirely possible for people to disregard their history of their movements.
Yeah, they
entirely.
This goes for almost every single aspect of the progressive agenda, is all rooted in the eugenicist origins of the progressive era. And it makes sense that Woodrow Wilson's administration was making statements like this, knowing what we know about the Fed and stuff like that. But yeah, even if you go back, Planned Parenthood has its roots in eugenicist policies. Margaret Sanger was a very famous eugenicist. And even the women's suffrage movement and the prohibition movement was against immigrants and undesirables. The whole WASP, because the original WASP white culture is progressivism from the early 20th century. But that's also an aside. To bring it back to the minimum wage issue, I found this excellent pair of articles on the Mises Wire, written by economist Ryan McMaken from the Mises Institute. He recommends this book written by Princeton scholar Thomas C. Leonard, entitled Illiberal Reformers: Race, Eugenics, and American Economics in the Progressive Era. And this looks like, I have not read this book, but it looks like a must-read, to be completely honest.
I haven't read it either, but I've heard it referenced in many, many different articles.
Yes. And there's some quotes that Ryan McMaken puts forward here, and here it is directly. Or I'll quote Ryan McMaken here. He makes the point, 1, it was assumed and fully admitted by progressives that a minimum wage would cause unemployment among the least skilled workers in society. Number 2, for the eugenicists, the resulting unemployment was a good thing because it allowed the experts, in quotes, to more easily cull those who were worthy of being allowed to continue to exist and reproduce from those who were not. Ouch. 3, such arguments for the minimum wage were also closely related to the racism inherent in early minimum wage arguments, which is covered in more detail here, and he provides a link. So we're gonna link in the show notes page to these 2 articles. We're also going to link in our Amazon affiliate link to that book, which sounds like essential reading, Eugenics and Economics in the Progressive Era. And I'm going to go home and beg my wife to let me spend, we got an Amazon gift card, and I'm going to beg her to let me spend it on this book. So we'll see what she says. But yeah, like I said, I mean, this does not surprise me at all. And listeners, you're going to have to check out these links and read for yourself, because there's a lot of good stuff here. And just like I've alluded to Planned Parenthood, and that's because I've listened to a James Corbett episode documenting these same influences within the plan and current influences within Planned Parenthood and the anti-minority, an unspoken genocide, in my opinion. But I digress. But before we kind of wrap things up here, there was just one more point that I wanted to bring up. In no way within the left-right paradigm right now is anyone presenting the idea that maybe there should be no minimum wage. You always get the idea that, the minimum wage should be X or it should be Y, but there's no mainstream voices saying get rid of the minimum wage, and I've had this before where I'd go up and I'd say, well, there should be no minimum wage, and everyone looks at you like, what?
Yeah, it's like you just said that. It's like you just said that 2 + 2 = 5. It's something that is just like, it's so beyond the realm of what is politically acceptable that unfortunately can have a lot of people dismiss you because of it. But it also can give people it also can get people's attention as well. The argument that whenever I tell someone that I'm opposed to the minimum wage, the argument that I give them is not one of economics, but I usually give them like the moral argument, where I say if two people have agreed to a contract, is it moral for someone to say that that contract cannot happen and to jail or threaten death against the people who've engaged in that contract? It's no one else's business but theirs.
Yeah.
And then usually you'll get a lot of people being like, but wait, exploitation or something. And I haven't found a quick and simple way to deconstruct the idea that when you're an employee of someone, that you're not being exploited and you're actually benefiting each other. So if any of you in the audience have a way to quickly say that, because it always takes me, probably 5 2-sentences many to explain why that you're not actually being exploited when you're working for a company.
Well, let me try. We have, so I would bring up the sweatshops example, and I would say, I'm all for sweatshops, kill me. I know there's other situations where it's like clearly not good, like slave contracts. Mm-hmm. But I'm talking about like, so they went over to, Africa, or I don't know where the study was from, and I'll find it and include it in the show notes later. But someone actually went over to the sweatshops and asked all the employees in the sweatshops, would you rather have more money or would you rather have better working conditions? And like 98% of the time they said, I'll take the money, please. Thank you.
Yeah. And that's something that's happened in, any place that's industrialized. It's people are moving out from working on farms to working in a sweatshop, like early factories within the United States and the UK were not pleasant places to work, but they paid better and people chose to do it. It's kind of weird whenever I remember from world history and US history in school, it never was addressed that like young women working in mills was an opportunity and was something that people wanted to do. It was always discussed in a negative manner and as something that was changing society, but not something that was, they always described it as something much more thrust upon people than something that than what reality was, where people were voluntarily choosing to live life in the countryside to make more money in a factory in the city.
Yes, exactly. And I think that's a good ending point for us here today. So through this episode, we have talked about the current thrust of minimum wage fanaticism that has swept the Pacific, the West Coast, and is now in the heartland in Minneapolis. It's been brewing here for quite some time, and it does not surprise me at all that this passed. But thankfully, for the moment, it is relegated to Minneapolis, and we'll see if it spreads anywhere else. And we'll be sure if that happens, we might do another episode on it here. But just as we're wrapping up here, a few housekeeping measures. As always, all of the source materials that we mentioned in the show will be linked in the show notes page, which may be found at libertyweekly.net/14. If you do end up purchasing some of those books through our Amazon affiliate link, the show will earn a small commission, not only for the linked books, but also for anything else that you order in that shopping session. If you have not yet signed up for our email list, doing so will get you 2 free ebooks. Email subscribers will also receive personalized email updates for every show that we drop. I've also been thinking about sending out a weekly book review where I will suggest must-have additions to your libertarian library, which you can also pick up through our Amazon affiliate link. As I mentioned in the beginning of the episode, to interact with me directly, be sure to give us a like on Facebook where we can chat about the show or about current events. You may find us on Facebook at facebook.com/Liberty Weekly. Also, Jerry has taken over the Liberty Weekly YouTube channel and will be dropping short videos where he will share his thoughts on current events. It will be a great, flexible way for the show to quickly respond to developing news stories, so I would definitely suggest that you check it out on our YouTube channel, which I will also link in the show notes page here. To experiment with this new format, we've already thrown up our thoughts on the CNN blackmailing story. And going forward here, definitely stay tuned for episode 15. I'm really excited about this one. We will be talking about the pending FBI investigation of Bernie and Jane Sanders for bank fraud. So you definitely want to check that one out, episode 15, which will release on Sunday. But thank you all for listening to another episode of the Liberty Weekly podcast. We hope that you'll come back soon.
Thank you.